Welcome again to our lecture series. I think you're going to be able to tell as the quarantine goes on, my hair is becoming slowly more disordered and disheveled. I apologize, but obviously I don't have access to a hairdresser, and I absolutely fear taking a razor to my hair myself. I'm sure the consequences will be absolutely tragic. In any case, so we're on today the third lecture of this kind of small mini-series within the course on Orthodoxy's relationship with other faiths in the Russian Empire and beyond. So we looked at the position of the tolerated faiths, we looked at the relationship with illegal faiths, schismatics and sectarians, the old believers, Baptists and so on. Tomorrow, in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at Orthodoxy in a particular local context, a particular non-Russian, non-Orthodox local context, that is the Baltic provinces of the Russian Empire. I think that's very appropriate given that this lecture series is coming from Tartu in Estonia. But today I want to look more generally speaking at the mission and missionaries of the Orthodox Church. That is to say, the institutions and people whose aim was to try and convert other peoples, non-Orthodox peoples, to Russian Orthodoxy. We're going to have a look at how this developed within Orthodoxy, general Orthodoxy, from the very beginning of its history, all the way through to its reception of an institutional, organized form at the end of the 19th beginning of the 20th centuries in Russia. And we'll finally conclude with just a few slides, which are more of a sort of addendum than part of the analysis about Russian Orthodoxy's, the missions which operated beyond the borders of the Russian Empire. So in this case, we're going to have a quick look at the Chinese and Japanese missions of the Russian Orthodox Church. So without further ado then, let's move on to our first section, which is precisely about the history of mission and missionaries within Orthodoxy in general, and a comparison of its missionary outreach, general strategies and tactics, and institutions that it received by the 17th century in comparison to the Protestant and Catholic confessions. So we begin appropriately in the beginning with the very sort of bases of the Christian faith and the Christian foundations for outreach to other peoples. From the very beginning, Christianity is a faith which actively is spread by its proponents among non-Christian peoples, principally in the first few centuries, the non-Christian peoples of the Roman Empire. And that this was the case is highly surprising when we consider a missionary impulse is hardwired into Christianity in its foundational texts, the Gospels and the New Testament. So here I've given you an example of one of Christ's commandments to his apostles to go forth and preach to the non-Christian peoples of the world and convert them. So Luke 9:1-6. I've given you here the, I think one of the more recent English translations, rather than my favorite, the King James version. Jesus called his 12 apostles together. He gave them the power to heal sickness and the power to force demons out of people. He sent them to tell about God's kingdom and to heal the sick. So the apostles went out. They traveled through all the towns. They told the good news and healed people everywhere. So we have here that the basic expectation of Christ from his followers, that his followers will spread his word, will spread his teachings beyond the borders of ancient Nazareth to the rest of the world. And according to Christian tradition, the apostles, the original saints, did indeed go forth across the world and spread the light of Christianity. Very famously, St. Peter and Paul end up in Rome, where St. Peter allegedly becomes the first pope of Christianity and is made a martyr. There is a long-standing tradition among the Syriac Christians of northern India, for instance, that their community was established by St. Thomas, who went there to follow Christ's commandments. And there is also a long-standing tradition, of course, almost certainly mythical, that St. Andrew went to what is today Ukraine, southern Russia, and preached Christianity there. And indeed, St. Andrew still has a certain status, a certain level of prestige among the canon of Russian Orthodox states, precisely because he was the first, allegedly, to go and preach Christianity in the Russian lands. And for that reason, in Russian, he's often called St. Andrew the First Called. Now, the foundations, I think, of a distinctive Orthodox approach to missionary activities can be found in the 8th and 9th centuries, when a competition arose between Rome and Constantinople. Now, it's important to note at this point, the two churches had not separated. This was only to come in the 11th century, with the middle of the 11th century, with the beginning of the Great Schism. However, the two churches had essentially been evolving. The two patriarchates, the two heads, the two capitals of the churches had essentially been evolving separately, and already had quite a significant level of distinction between them. Whereas in Rome, for instance, the language of the liturgy, the language of administration had become Latin. In Constantinople, the language of administration and the liturgy was Greek. And both groups were involved in various territorial disputes, trying to expand their own reach, often at the expense of the other. Now, of course, in this period of Eastern European history, there are many migrations entering into the Balkans, into northeastern Europe from the Asiatic steppe. Various horse-riding peoples, including the ancestors of all Slavic peoples today, the Slavs. And there was competition between Rome and Constantinople over who would convert and bring into their jurisdiction these pagan Slavic peoples. A focal point was the so-called Kingdom of Moravia, existing at the end of the 9th, the end of the 9th, the beginning of the 10th century. A very large medieval Slavic kingdom, which today, it basically covered what is today Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And both Rome and Constantinople adopt quite significantly different approaches on how they're going to bring these new Slavic peoples into their respective jurisdictions. Now, to cut a very long story short, Rome wins, and these people join Latin-speaking Western Christendom, coming under the jurisdiction of the Roman Church and the Roman Pope, a status which has endured until the present day. However, this does not mean to say we can discount the strategy taken by the Orthodox Church, because it was to have long-lasting results. So what was this approach? Well, basically, the two monastic brothers, Cyril and Methodius, Kirill and Methody in Russian, decided their approach to these potential new Slavic converts should be to try and translate the Bible and other religious texts into the new Slavic languages. But there was a problem, of course, is that these Slavic peoples were, as far as we are aware, entirely illiterate people. They did not have an alphabet, unlike Latin and like Greek, and like Syriac. And so Saint Cyril sat down and created an entirely new written language for the Slavs, known today as the Glagolitic alphabet. Now, it should be noted, I mean, I'm not a linguist by any stretch of the imagination, but linguists have argued that the Glagolitic is an extremely well-constructed artificial language. However, it was inherently and deeply complex. And so over the course of the next century, it slowly becomes simplified and simplified until it reaches the state of what we regard as the Cyrillic alphabet today, the alphabet used by large portions of southern and eastern Slavs, so Russians, Ukrainians, Serbs, Macedonians, Bulgarians, Belarusians. And while the Orthodox Church, the Church of Constantinople, had failed to bring in the Kingdom of Moravia to its jurisdiction under its aegis, through this new written language, through precisely proclamating the holy texts and creating a new liturgical tradition in the language of the Slavs, Constantinople did ultimately have a lot of success in bringing in large portions of these new Slavic peoples in the Balkans and Eastern Europe into the Orthodox Church. And this established a long tradition in Orthodoxy, as opposed to Catholicism. Catholicism, until really the middle of the 20th century, in the Second Vatican Council, rigidly stuck to the idea that Latin should be always, whenever possible, the language of church administration and the language of liturgical life. Catholicism proved remarkably inflexible on this particular point. We should remember one of the reasons for the Reformation's early successes in Europe was precisely because the new Protestant churches translated Bibles into local languages, preached in local languages, insisted on the use of local languages in church life. Whereas, of course, the Catholic Church remained steadfast behind Latin, a language the overwhelming majority of people did not, on any kind of level, really understand. Now, Russia's conversion to Orthodoxy illustrates this point. Now, the Byzantine Empire and the people known as the Rus, the ancestor of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian peoples today, had been interacting in some extent already in the 9th century, when the Rus made numerous failed attempts to try and conquer Constantinople and invade the rich territories of the Byzantine Greek-speaking empire. And just to reiterate, by the way, in case you, I have said this before in this lecture series, but in case you've forgotten, the Byzantine Empire, otherwise sometimes known as Byzantium, was basically what we'd say today is the territories of Turkey, the Balkans, parts of the Near East, and it was an Orthodox Greek-speaking empire. There were some initial attempts to Christianize the Rus, but they mostly failed. This changed notoriously in 988, or at least that is the date that especially 19th century historians, set as the date for the conversion of the Rus, when the great leader of the Kievan state, Prince Vladimir, converted not only personally but on the behalf of all of his people to Orthodoxy. Now, why did he do so? Well, we can take the quite romantic and very well-known narrative from the primary chronicle, that is to say, the oldest source of Russian medieval history, which iterates the following narrative: that Prince Vladimir decided he wanted a single monolithic faith to unite his empire, to unite his kingdom, to unite his people. And he sent emissaries to Catholic countries, to Islamic countries, to Jewish countries. And he also sent an emissary to Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire. And the emissary famously reported back on having seen the liturgy conducted in the Hagia Sophia, the main cathedral in Constantinople. It was so beautiful, we did not know whether we were on earth or in heaven. Now, more practically speaking, there are other reasons. Very probably, we have to remember that Byzantium was by far one of the richest, largest, most powerful states in Europe at the time, and by converting to to Orthodoxy, Prince Vladimir gained association with the Byzantine Empire. And of course, as was equally important, I think, to Vladimir, was it enabled him to marry the daughter of the Byzantine emperor, part of a strategic alliance to basically persuade the Rus to help the Byzantines in their campaigns in the Balkans. And marrying the daughter of a Byzantine emperor was a very big deal. It was certainly a huge boost to Rus, the Kievan state's international prestige. So then, I've already given you a sort of insight into how these missionary efforts compare and contrast with each other. The various different missionary efforts launched by different different Christian denominations. But here, just to give you a very brief overview of probably centuries and centuries of missionary history throughout Europe and the rest of the world. Catholicism's missionary tradition is long and storied, dating back really into the medieval period, having monastic orders dedicated precisely to the idea of outreach to non-Christian peoples and converting them in the name of the church. This certainly became even more prominent with the discovery of the New World in the 16th century, in the 15th century, and the expansion of trade links with Asia and Africa following the development of naval technologies. The most famous, of course, is probably the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, but also we might talk about the Franciscans, both of whom played a key role in spreading Christianity among the native peoples of the Americas, spreading Christianity in Africa, and attempting to establish Christian traditions in India, China, and initially at least Japan. Protestantism was a bit slower to the uptake. It didn't really have an institutionalized mission as such during its earliest centuries, the 16th and 17th centuries. But it certainly started to gain institutionalized missions in the 18th century, particularly among leading global Protestant nations like Great Britain. who, through its empire, was able to provide an infrastructure for the massive expansion of Protestant missionary efforts in places like, especially in Africa in the 19th century. Now the comparison. After the conversion of the Slavs in the 9th and 10th centuries, we don't really see much missionary activity from the various Orthodox churches. And that really is true until the present day. Most Orthodox churches are generally concerned with overseeing the affairs of their particular national group. So, for instance, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church deals with the Bulgarian Orthodox, whether they be in Bulgaria itself or in emigration. Similarly, for the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, etc., etc. One reason for this, of course, is the fact that most of the Orthodox churches from the end of the 15th, 16th centuries onwards are no longer in independent states. They are under the control of the Ottoman Turkish Sultan. And the Ottoman Turkish Sultan does give Orthodox churches a degree of tolerated existence, but this extension of toleration does not really cover the establishment of missionary efforts. And as we can see, the one exception, the one area where Orthodoxy is being spread by the Orthodox Church is Russia, whose independent empire provides it with the infrastructure to allow it to spread to various non-Russian, non-Orthodox peoples. Having said this, as we're going to see, for the Orthodox Church to become the Orthodox mission to become fully institutionalized takes really until the end of the 19th century. So again, I just want to reiterate some general points from this. Perhaps the most important characteristic of Orthodox missionary movements has been, and maybe still is today, their general flexibility when it comes to language. Orthodox churches, generally speaking, have been willing to translate the holy texts, liturgical texts, and other religious materials into the native languages of convert groups, therefore greatly easing the spread of Orthodox Christianity. This is in contrast to Catholicism, which is generally, until the middle of the 20th century, stuck rigidly behind the idea that Latin should always be the liturgical language, the administrative language of the Church. Secondly, in comparison to Catholicism and Protestantism, Orthodoxy has not really been propagated by its churches among other peoples, with the exception of Russia. Generally speaking, these churches are occupied with maintaining their own groups, taking care of their own national groups in their home territories. If there is an expansion, they generally expand to take care of emigres who have migrated to other places. So let's have a look at some early examples. Let's go through the history, really, of the Orthodox mission. Obviously, as per usual in this course, I'm going to focus most heavily on the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, but there are some interesting instances of Orthodox mission in medieval and early modern Russian history, which I think it's worth just having a quick look at. Firstly, an overview then. Russian Orthodoxy, as we have seen throughout this course, enjoyed the support of the state in most of its endeavors. These included missionary endeavors. And at various points, the Russian Orthodox state encourages and supports the conversion of various groups into Orthodoxy. As we're going to see, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, the state is quite interested to see the elites of conquered areas join to Russian Orthodoxy, and in order to help that process along, it can offer various benefits. Economic, social benefits. But as we saw in the last lecture, if the state wished to try and eliminate various groups, as we saw, and push their members into Orthodoxy, as we saw was the case for the Old Believers and the Uniate Church, especially under Nicholas I, the state could deploy heavy repressive measures against these groups in favor of Russian Orthodoxy. Now, when we're discussing conversions, often we take this approach of looking at the conversions from the perspective of the church, from the perspective of the state, and the perspective of the missionaries. Often because these were the literate individuals involved, and they left copious amounts of material which we historians can read. However, we should remember that conversion for the people who are converting serves a myriad of purposes. As we're going to see in our next lecture, Latvian and Estonian converts to Russian Orthodoxy in the 19th century, when mass conversion waves occurred in the Baltic provinces. They convert precisely in response to their socio-economic condition in the Baltic, generally in response to their poverty, their powerlessness in the face of overwhelming dominance by the Baltic German aristocratic and commercial elites. They use conversion to try and bring the Russian state in on their side. So you see here how conversion is being used by subject peoples in order to serve their own goals, their own ends, not just the goals and ends of the Russian Orthodox Church or the Russian state. And on a more personal level, as I'm sure you're aware, there are many, many reasons why people choose to change religion beyond simply a transformation of conviction, of religious convictions. People might do so, for instance, to ease family life. Remember that in mixed marriages, when they were allowed by Peter the Great in 1721, the non-Orthodox partner had to swear to various provisions to defend swear various provisions forbidding them from trying to tempt their Orthodox partner into their religion, and swearing to raise the child in Orthodoxy. So, of course, joining Orthodoxy when marrying an Orthodox person could actually be a logical solution to avoid all these kind of legal arrangements. We saw among Old Believers might go to an Orthodox priest for the marriage rituals and various other registered rituals in order to legitimize their marriages, legitimize their children, and avoid attracting the gaze of the state. So one of the early, very early, Russian Orthodox missions occurs in the 14th century. And this is the mission of Saint Stephan, who, born in a central province of Russia, goes to what were then the eastern edges of medieval Russia, the Ural Mountains, to convert the non-Russian speaking peoples of that region, principally the Komi, a Finno-Ugric group who live mostly in sort of the northern Urals. And the reason I mention it here is, again, to show the vitality of this tradition established by Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius when approaching the Slavs. Saint Stephan, when approaching the Komi, decides that the major way to approach them, the best way to approach them, is to translate the holy texts and the liturgical language into the Komi language. And just like his esteemed predecessors, Cyril and Methodius, Stephan creates a new alphabet for the Komi people, known as Old Permic. Now, Old Permic dies out, or at least sort of enters into severe decline by the 17th century, at which point most Komi people are speaking Russian anyway, or at least on one level. But this approach is generally argued to have been successful. Today, most Komi are either Orthodox, and there are also some old-believing Komi, old-believer Komis among the population. And this mission essentially was institutionalized in 1383 through the creation of the first diocese of Perm, and Stephan becomes the bishop of Perm. Perm, by the way, is the major sort of Russian city on the western side of the Urals. It's the first really big Russian urban settlement in the region of the Urals. And here, by the way, it's quite just interesting to show you. This is the so-called Old Permic alphabet created by Saint Stephan. I believe there were some attempts in the late 19th century. I'll have to check this to be absolutely sure, but I believe there were some attempts in the late 19th century when sort of autonomist, almost quasi-nationalist movements began to arise among the Komi people to sort of reactivate this alphabet, reactivate usage of the Komi language in public life, in books and texts. But again, just to reiterate the point, this is illustrative of how the Russian Orthodox Church assumes some of the patterns of its predecessors, preferring to translate, be flexible with the language being used by convert peoples in an attempt to ease the spread of Orthodoxy. This is where, just in case you were not aware, this is where the sort of Komi people are located today. So you can see in the map on the red, the area where sort of most Komi live in modern Russia. Now, the sort of next big effort to convert non-Orthodox peoples to Orthodoxy comes in the 16th and 17th centuries, in the wake of the Russian Empire's expansion to the east into the Tartar Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Sibir. Now, we'll talk more about Sibir in a second. But as Russia moves out down on the Volga, takes Kazan, it begins a centuries-long project of essentially trying to remodel Kazan and the Kazan region into an Orthodox majority location. The Tatars, by the way, were mostly Muslim people, although there were certainly Finno-Ugric and Turkic groups who were polytheists, nature worshippers in the region. Now, the most obvious way in which the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church seeks to turn Kazan into an Orthodox place is by transforming the urban environment of the city. That is to say, by creating lots and lots of new Orthodox churches in the in the environs of the town. Therefore, using architecture to very, very visibly demonstrate the victory of Russian Orthodoxy over Tartar Islam on the Volga, in the Volga region. Now, the Russian state's approach to the Muslim Tartars themselves is, in this early period, rather sporadic. The Russian state is most interested in attracting the elites of these Muslim groups, so their princes, their leaders. And to do so, basically, it wants to use these people in its administration and in its armies. And so to attract them to orthodoxy generally, rather than using direct pressure, although certainly there were occasions when pressure was used, it offered these elites very plausible material, very concrete material benefits for converting to orthodoxy. So, for instance, taxation privileges, the grants of land, granting of positions, all of which could be obtained through conversion. This policy largely persists under Peter, and it's only really challenged by Peter's daughter, Empress Elizabeth, in the 1740s and 1750s, when she takes on a hugely different approach to both the Islamic and polytheist peoples on the Volga. She, for all intents and purposes, seeks to push as many people as possible into orthodoxy from these groups and to radically reform the religious landscape of the region. To this end, for instance, I've given you the figure here, she demolishes the vast majority of mosques in the Kazan region. She also launches intensive, forceful conversion campaigns against the Finno-Ugric and Chuvash groups on the Volga, pushing around about 95% of them into orthodoxy, using the tool of mass baptism. So basically, you can imagine that most of these people joining to Russian Orthodoxy in the course of these conversion efforts are not sincere converts. They're not doing so because they're not changing their faith because they truly believe that Orthodoxy is a better faith or a truer faith than their previous religions. They're doing it because they're being forced by soldiers, being plunged into, mass baptized in lakes. There is no real kind of account for individual motives, individual convictions. This is one of sort of the most notorious sort of examples of intolerance, by the way, in the Russian Empire's history, along with the destruction of the Uniate and all believer churches and the campaign launched against the Baptists at the end of the 19th century. Now, another area where the Russian Orthodox Church started to experiment with gaining converts was, in the 17th and 18th century, was the Old Believers. Now, for those of you who can remember our last lecture, we talked about the early strategies of the state and church against old belief. And this was an overwhelmingly punitive strategy. In other words, it basically consists of sending soldiers after old believers, telling them to repent or face death, imprisonment and death. Now, when Peter sort of rolled out a more tolerant approach to the old believers at the beginning of the 18th century, basically allowing old belief to exist so long as it was willing to put up with extremely heavy limitations, Limitations so heavy, in fact, it drove away most of the old believers. The Orthodox Church, too, began to experiment with techniques not so heavily reliant on police and army or power. In Nizhny Novgorod, a province heavily populated by the old believers, the local bishop and the Peter Lim, starts some innovative new approaches, creating a school to train missionaries, for instance, against the old believers. And one of the crucial things that Peter Lim develops as a missionary tool is the so-called besieda, a religious debate held between a missionary and a non-Orthodox religious officiant or community leader. And the idea basically is this: in the course of a public debate, the Russian Orthodox missionary can publicly persuade his audience, an audience consisting of non-Orthodox or old believer members. He can publicly show the errors of the old believer or non-Orthodox position, and he can demonstrate through knowledge of the texts, through his own learning, erudition, and eloquence, the strengths, advantages, and the truth of Russian Orthodoxy. Now, however, despite these early efforts with establishing a old believer mission, the first true institutionalized mission against the old believers only really emerges at the beginning of the 20th century. The beginning of the 19th century. We start to see missions being established in Perm, for instance, in 1828. Missions against the old believers also established in the Baltic provinces, in Riga, at about the same time. And of course, this is very much connected with Nicholas's anti-old believer policies. When I say the mission is established as an institution, there's no real separate institutional base for missionary activities. There's no particular individuals who become missionaries in the 18th century. Mission, when it happens, tends to be conducted by priests and bishops who have no particular training, are not working out of a particular institution dedicated to missionary efforts. They're essentially they're essentially normal sort of church people, bishops and priests who conduct irregularly missionary activities. They're not officially missionaries working out of specialized missionary institutions. This is what occurs in the 1828, 1830s, with the establishment of increasingly specialized training for people undertaking anti-old believer activities. Now, just to comment on the besieda as a technique. Well, of course, it's attempting to use public spectacle, attempting to embarrass and outwit and outmaneuver a non-Orthodox or old believer leader in front of their entire community. And through that embarrassment, persuade the community that they should rejoin the Orthodox faith. And the besieda remains probably the most fundamental missionary tool of Russian Orthodox missionaries up until 1917. Even though it was, from the end of the 19th century onwards, becoming increasingly criticized as an outmoded and indeed counterproductive way of approaching non-Orthodox peoples. If we talk about the Old Believer context, for instance, it could be quite difficult for the Old Believers, for Orthodox missionaries, to outwit and outmaneuver the Old Believer religious leaders. As I noted in the last lecture, the Old Believers, one of their major characteristics is their great literacy, the great levels of literacy. Their leaders tended, as a rule, to be not only highly literate, but also extremely well read in the relevant texts. Some of them just as well read, perhaps even more well read, than seminary-educated Russian Orthodox priests, at least in a certain core body of religious texts. And that, of course, was the core body of religious texts that Old Believers were interested in. And the other quite obvious problem, I think, is that if you are an Orthodox priest in a community trying to conduct this kind of debate, in a community which is obviously, in some extent, hostile towards you, then it's very easy for your opponent to manipulate that community to basically render your speech impractical, absurd. We find things like people working in Old Believer communities, trying to conduct Besieda in Old Believer communities. The Old Believers would constantly change the dates. The people wouldn't show up at the right time. They would show up at different places, constantly essentially trying to outmaneuver the Orthodox priest, constantly trying to put him on, the Orthodox missionary, trying to put him on edge. They packed audiences with their supporters to make sure the Orthodox priest did not get a friendly reception, etc., etc. In other words, this is not the most productive missionary weapon. And I think you can tell this through the basic results. I mean, really, the Russian Orthodox Church's anti-Old Believer mission never really succeeds. The Old Believers are extremely numerous by the beginning of the 20th century, extremely influential in cultural, financial, social, even political terms after the Edicts of Toleration in 1905. The only times when the Russian Orthodox Church does really have any success among the Old Believers is under Nicholas I, precisely because Nicholas I throws a whole range of police, administrative, and legal measures against the Old Believers. I think that Besieda as a technique only ever really had very limited success, very limited results. Now let's go back to the mission as it follows Russian imperial expansion. So at the end of the 16th century, the Cossacks, Cossack soldiers representing the Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible conquer the Khanate of Sibir and thus open up the vast wilderness of Siberia to Russian invasion. And indeed, by the end of the 17th century, quite rapidly really, the Russians have reached the Pacific Ocean. And as they go, they establish chains of military forts containing small towns settled by soldiers and bureaucrats mostly, but also increasingly by exiled peasants, a very small number of free colonial settlers, etc., etc. The Cossacks do not stop when they reach the Pacific Ocean, but indeed cross it at the beginning of the 18th century, using small boats to hop across islands and ending up in Alaska. And Alaska is part of the Russian Empire until the middle of the 19th century, until 1867, when the Russian government finally believes it's too much of a strategic liability to maintain this territory and sells it to the United States of America. And one reason they sell it to the United States of America is precisely because they don't want the British in Canada to obtain it. And the British were one of Russia's largest sort of colonial rival at the time. By the way, it's also worth noting, the Russians did actually manage to establish a very small sort of colonial town, Fort Ross, in California. But this, a very small, limited settlement, which basically became part of the United States in the 19th century. Now, it's worth noting that this entire region of Siberia was very underpopulated throughout the period we're discussing. Indeed, of course, we say today, Siberia is generally, given its size, is an underpopulated region. But this was especially the case in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries immediately after the Russian annexation. As I mentioned, most of the Russians there were soldiers, bureaucrats, a very limited number of free settlers, and a lot of people who had been exiled there for committing various offences in the Russian core territories. And as a consequence, this meant that church infrastructure itself was very weak. For much of the 18th century, this territory was divided between two dioceses: the Diocese of Tobolsk in the western Siberia and the Diocese of Irkutsk in the east. So for this huge territory, there are essentially only two church institutions until really into the 19th century. And as a consequence, the Orthodox Church there does not really have either institutional support or the manpower to launch Orthodox missionary attempts among the native Siberian peoples. And the Russian state wasn't particularly interested in supporting these either. The Russian state's concern with the native Siberian peoples was that they paid their tribute in furs and other valuable resources, and that they remained loyal. Didn't rebel, basically. Didn't have much interest in helping the Russian Orthodox Church spread orthodoxy in this region. And I'm giving you one result. So, for instance, during the entirety of the sort of 17th and 18th, late 17th, 18th centuries, only 500 Altaians, that is to say, the Turkic-speaking inhabitants of the Altai mountain region in southern western Siberia, join Orthodoxy for the entirety of this time period. This situation, however, changes drastically in the 19th century, with the establishment of properly institutionalized missions reaching out to the peoples of Siberia and Alaska. And I was going to see the Alaskan mission was in fact established at the end of the 18th century, relatively early, although it didn't enjoy much success in that time period. But let's have a look firstly now at the Altai. So the major figure when it comes to converting the Altaians to Russian Orthodoxy is Makarly Gluharev, a gifted linguist. He'd been heavily involved in translating, certainly one of the most gifted Hebraicists, that is, speaker of Hebrew or studier of Hebrew in the Russian Empire in this period. He was heavily involved in the translation, the early efforts in the beginning of the 19th century to translate the Bible into modern Russian. And he was a pupil of possibly the most famous Russian Orthodox churchman, of the 19th century metropolitan Philaret Drozdov. Now, Macaulay had a somewhat adventurous streak, and already some way into his career, he was a monk, by the way, just to make that absolutely clear. Macaulay had taken monastic vows. In 1828, he decided he wanted to conduct services among non-Russian peoples, to try and bring the light of orthodoxy and the word of God to what Russia and what the Russian Orthodox Church perceived as a barbaric, unenlightened, uncivilized people. And the location that was chosen for him was the Altai. Now, after spending a couple of years learning to a certain extent the native language, preparing for his trip, in 1830 he went and established in the small town of Bisk, one of the largest, what was to become one of the largest established institutionalized Orthodox missions in Siberia, the Altai Spiritual Mission. And one of Macaulay's main goals when he establishes the mission is that the missionaries have to lead by example. They have to show these quote-unquote enlightened and civilized peoples how Christians and civilized individuals should live. And for that reason, he established a quasi-monastic order for the missionaries of the Altai Spiritual Mission. This meant, the repudiation of worldly pleasures, sharing property in common, sharing communal meals, etc., etc. Much of the same went on in kind of Cenobitic monasteries at the time. By showing this very pious, very dedicated life, Macaulay hoped basically that the missionaries would be able to lead the people, the Altaians, by moral example. By the way, just to be absolutely clear, this is the modern day Altai in the Russian Federation. It was known in the 19th century and still is known today as the supposed Siberian Switzerland. It's a remarkably beautiful region of the world. I just thought I'd show you sort of one picture here of what the Altai looks like. Perhaps you can imagine sort of Saint Macaulay walking along these hills, going to convert the local peoples and coming across various obstacles and problems as he did. Now, Macaulay had several other techniques, approaches which form the basis of his missionary strategy. Now, for one thing, Macaulay absolutely repudiated the mass baptisms, the mass conversions that the Russian state had undertaken in the 18th century in the Volga, and to a certain extent was still using in some areas of Siberia. Like at this time in Irkutsk among the Burats, for instance, there are recorded instances of mass baptisms being deployed. For Macaulay, the fundamental thing was that individuals, not groups, individuals had to reach a consciousness of the truth of Christ and had to make a resolute personal decision to convert to Orthodoxy. A decision that would be confirmed through an individualized baptismal, for the individualized sacrament of the baptism. Now, it should be noted that while Macaulay never really focused too intensively on having his missionaries preach in the native language in the Altai, a Turkic Mongolic language, he never really sort of considered this or evaluated it as a key missionary tool. Nonetheless, a large number of key religious texts were translated into the Altai language. Now, Macaulay was not a pure idealist. He recognized that one reason Orthodox Christianity could be attractive to these quasi-nomadic people, or peoples rather, was that Orthodoxy could bring with it certain material benefits. Benefits produced modern implements, modern equipment, modern tools being produced in Russia that were being held as attributes of Russian civilization. Certainly, Macaulay believed that Russian medicine could attract these individuals to convert to Orthodoxy. Certainly, he believed that by offering things like schools, rifles, modern agricultural instruments, he could attract them to Orthodoxy by offering them new, advantageous, modern equipment. And finally, Macaulay took some measures that essentially were aimed at sort of firstly, at separating converts from their previous environment. Often a problem for missionaries, not just in these contexts, but in many other contexts throughout time and across the world, is the fact that these converts even still have to live among friends, families, communities which have not converted, and which therefore often place social community pressure to abandon the conversion and return to one's original faith. Now, Macaulay attempts to sort of forestall this by basically insisting that by founding villages for the converts. Therefore, separating them from their previous families, families and friends who remained in the old faith. And by the old sort of faith in the Altai was basically, again, a sort of polytheistic, nature-worshipping cult. Another purpose, of course, is that we should remember Macaulay and his associates see this to a considerable extent. Not just about bringing Christianity to these peoples, but about bringing civilization to these groups. This is, in other words, an imperial civilizing mission. And one of the reasons Macaulay creates villages is because he wants to give these people, principally nomads, a settled pastoral version of life. Because in the conception of what was civilized and what was not of the time, it was generally argued that a non-settled, nomadic existence was a mark of barbarism, of a lack of development, whereas being settled, being a permanently placed population, was a mark at least of entering the first steps of becoming a civilized and modern people. So both, I would say, Macaulay's approach then is underwritten by a certain commitment to language, the use of modern equipment, techniques, knowledge to attract the Altaians, the creation of villages which separate them from their previous families and friends, while also supposedly elevating them along the ladder of civilization, and of course insisting that conversion is a voluntary step. And indeed, Macaulay's approach bears a considerable amount of success. He himself notes that there were 625 conversions during his time in the Altai. Now keep in mind, for the entirety of the 18th century, there had been 500 conversions to Orthodoxy in the Altai. So already Macaulay is significantly expanding the spread of Russian Orthodoxy through his personal presence alone. And throughout the almost century of the Altai spiritual mission's existence, it truly develops a large-standing institutionalized mission made up of 21 stations, 2 monasteries, 2 convents, 74 schools, and its own religious college. As a result, by the beginning of the First World War, the majority of Altaians had converted to Russian Orthodoxy, 55%, establishing, in doing so, very much a native tradition of Orthodoxy in this region, an Altaian form of Orthodoxy. Native Altaians themselves, attending these schools, were able to become priests and instructors, bringing more and more texts into religious texts and religious ceremonies into the Altai language, and indeed sometimes even adapting rituals to better suit this Altaian flock. Now, another example of a successful missionary effort is in Alaska, which, as we noted, had been conquered by the Cossacks in 1733. Now, Alaska was something different from many of the other provinces of the Russian Empire. It was administered in a way similar to how the British and the Dutch initially administered their sort of foreign colonies in Southeast Asia. It was not administered through the imperial government itself, but rather by a quasi-state trading company, the Russian American Company. Now, there was always, the Russian presence in Alaska was always very, very small, mostly made up of Cossacks, Cossack settlers, male Cossack settlers, who went there largely to hunt seals, basically to send back to St. Petersburg as part of the fur trade. Now, the first mission was set up there at the very end of the 18th century in 1794 by another monk, Archimandrite Iosif. But the mission is largely unsuccessful. It doesn't really gain many converts or establish any deep roots in Alaska among the various Alaskan peoples. Largely because the mission enters into a deep and direct conflict with the Russian-American trading company. The company basically used very close to what other European powers had done throughout the world, used vodka and strong spirits as a payment method for those natives who helped it obtain things like natural resources, especially furs and seal oil. And the reason it used vodka was, of course, that it knew, very, very precisely knew, that these natives had no real natural resilience to alcoholic spirits. The people became hopelessly addicted and therefore became hopelessly in debt to the company, which for all intents and purposes kept them in a form of permanent indentured labour. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church, to its credit, I think, in this at least this one very limited case, did oppose this use of vodka as a way to sort of pay and indeed enslave the native peoples. And as a result, there were several clashes with between the Orthodox Church and the company, which essentially deprived the Orthodox Church of the vital administrative support it needed in Alaska to make the mission a resounding success. So the situation changed drastically a couple of decades later, when the priest Innokenty Venyaminov went to serve in Alaska, which he did for about 15 years. And he really managed to establish the presence not only of a permanent Russian mission in Alaska, but also the beginning of a new independent Orthodox tradition, the Alaskan Orthodox tradition, which remains a vital force in Alaska and parts of far western Canada to this day. Innokenty's strategies, again, resemble closely those of his contemporary Makary Glucharev. Again, he takes the approach of trying to translate a large number of religious texts into the various native languages being spoken by the different peoples in Alaska. However, he continues to insist that Old Church Slavonic be the language of the liturgy. So here we see the tradition of translating texts and religious rituals and ceremonies into native languages had some limitations. Innokenty continued to believe that the Old Church Slavonic liturgy was a key characteristic of the Russian Orthodoxy that was spreading and therefore had to be maintained. Just like Makary, Innokenty used the advantages, the material advantages of modern Russian culture to persuade the groups to convert. Medicine, again, assumed a considerable role. Vaccinations in Russia, as indeed in other parts of Europe, had come in use at the end of the 18th century, especially against smallpox. And Innokenty insisted on campaigns of vaccination of the native Alaskans to ensure their immunity against smallpox and to prevent the deadly outbreaks from ravaging their population. He opened the mission that he founded, was relatively quick to start opening schools in the area to offer the native Alaskans a degree of literacy, a degree of education, a degree of self-improvement, and ultimately to provide a route for some Alaskans to enter the priesthood. But one of the sort of noteworthy elements of the Alaskan mission of Saint Innocenti was his drive to root out the religious rituals and ceremonies that had previously predominated the region, declaring them to be superstitious, morally harmful. He launched campaigns to prevent, for instance, previous notions of coupling between men and women in the region, and establish marriage as the only route in which men and women could legitimately, firstly, have sex, and secondly, create families. He also attempts to drive out shaman and native shamanistic traditions, replacing these festivals and holidays with Russian Orthodox, not equivalents, Russian Orthodox replacements, alternatives. And as mentioned, the mission in Alaska ultimately proved both long-lasting and successful, for all intents and purposes turning Orthodoxy into the major religion of these groups, and creating a native form of Orthodoxy, which began to, especially at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, to adapt various Orthodox rituals and customs in accordance with its own, traditions, creating, for all intents and purposes, a truly Alaskan form of Orthodoxy. Now, we need now to look at one of the major missionary efforts in Imperial Russia. We need to return to the Volga region, where, as you remember from a few slides ago, we saw had been the subject of mass conversion efforts in the reign of Empress Elizabeth, which resulted in 95% of the polytheistic peoples being converted to Orthodoxy, and a large number of mosques in the region being closed. This, of course, created problems. You had continual threats that this forced convert population might attempt to return to their previous faith. After all, they had never been truly convinced of the truth, of the light of Orthodoxy, because they had been forced to convert. And at the same time, in the region, the quite advanced status of the Tartar Muslims presented a potentially competing missionary force. Now, the founder of the Orthodox Church's new approach in this region was Professor Nikolai Ilminsky. Now, he was from the clerical estate. His father was a priest, and he went through the usual hierarchy of church educational establishments, so the seminary, and finally the ecclesiastical academy, although he himself never decided to become a priest, instead specializing in scholarship, research, and practical missionary outreach. Now, during his time at the Kazan Ecclesiastical Academy, he undertook specialized study in Islamic languages, so both the local Tartar language, but also Arabic and a few others. Now, this has been long in the region, by the way. I mentioned before, this is one of the reasons why the Kazan, one of the four ecclesiastical academies of the empire, was located in Kazan. It was supposed to be a specialized institution for teaching churchmen Eastern languages, whether that be Tartar, Arabic, the languages of the Caucasus, or some of the languages of Siberia. Now, Professor Ilminsky was a talented student and a talented linguist. He managed to quite thoroughly master Tartar, And just before the Crimean War, between 1851 and 1853, he was dispatched to the Middle East to go and learn more about Islam, to complete his studies of Arabic, and generally become better acquainted with both Islamic theology and how Islam functioned as a religion. Returning to Russia after this trip, he was made professor of what was then known as anti-Islamic studies at the Kazan Ecclesiastical Academy. Now, this was a relatively new subject established in 1845 precisely for the training of missionaries and church actors to counteract Islam's influence in regions like the Volga, Crimea, the Caucasus, and in some parts of Siberia. And as we're going to see, the ecclesiastical academies played host to a variety of chairs of non-Orthodox religions in this period to train missionaries. Now, as I mentioned, the situation on the Volga was not particularly advantageous to Orthodoxy. Although a large number of the Volga peoples of the polytheistic Volga peoples had been converted to Orthodoxy in the middle of the 18th century by Catherine, these forced conversions had not really produced a convinced flock. And there was little in the way of Orthodox infrastructure in the region to ensure that they remained in Orthodoxy. Very few churches, very few priests who spoke the necessary languages, very little institutional infrastructure. On the other hand, Orthodoxy feared that the relatively high level of culture possessed by the Muslim Tartars meant that they constituted a competing missionary force in the region. In other words, that they would convert these people to Islam before Orthodoxy had the opportunity to convert them for the church, or would tempt them away from the church to Islam. Now remember, in the 1850s, there was the Crimean War against the Ottoman Turkish Empire, an officially Muslim state where the Sultan was the Caliph of Islam, the highest spiritual figure in Sunni Islam. And so many doubts had been cast about the loyalty of Muslims in the Russian Empire during this period, leading indeed in the Crimea to what amounted to a policy of ethnic cleansing, both during the war and after it, as large numbers of Muslim Tartars were essentially thrown out of the Russian Empire and sent to the Ottoman Empire. These general fears about the loyalty of the Tartar population in the Volga and elsewhere were only accentuated in the 1860s, when an apostasy wave spread throughout the formerly polytheist peoples, converting away from Russian Orthodoxy to Islam. And it was recognized by Erminsky, by the Russian state, and by the Russian church that a new approach was necessary to keep these people in Orthodoxy and to convert those who were not Orthodox to the church. Ilminsky came up with what was later known as the Ilminsky system. And the Ilminsky system was basically this. He argued that Orthodoxy and Russian culture could only be spread among various non-Orthodox, non-Russian peoples. If that Orthodoxy and that Russian culture was conveyed to those peoples in their native languages. As such, he put a huge emphasis on the translation of Orthodox religious materials into the various languages used in this region, the establishment of preaching in the languages of the region, and of teaching missionaries to operate in these languages. He himself was heavily involved in the translation efforts. And indeed, following precedents like Saint Stephan of Perm, for instance, he created a Cyrillic alphabet for the Tartar language. So previously, the Tartar language had been rendered exclusively in Arabic. Ilminsky created a new Cyrillic version for the Tartar language. Obviously, there was also a massive emphasis on education, on establishing Orthodox schools in the region that would teach the children about Orthodoxy and, to an extent, about Russian culture and civilization in their native languages. And Ilminsky clashed quite heavily with the Russian nationalists of the time, who insisted that the first step of bringing these people in was not Christianization, was not encouraging native languages, but rather by imposing Russian on these peoples and then bring them into Christianity. So Ilminsky's system was the idea of teaching them, of teaching people in their native languages, gaining conversion, and then introducing them to Russian culture and the Russian language. The Russian nationalists, the Russifiers, had a very different approach, which was the idea of introducing Russian language first. The Russian language as the foremost, most important thing to introduce among these people, and only then being concerned more with their Christianization, their conversion into Orthodoxy. Now, despite a large range of, a wide success, not just in the Volga region, but elsewhere, his example was copied across the Russian Empire. When Ilminsky died in 1892, his system was beset by opponents. Remember, the 1880s, 1890s are the high point of Russification campaigns in the empire, going on in places like the Baltic, Poland, Lithuania, Finland, but also in the Volga region. And Ilminsky's system is increasingly criticized by these Russifiers, these Russian nationalists, because they see within it a real danger. They believe that Ilminsky, by proclamating the native languages of these people, by encouraging the native tuition and development of the native languages of these Volga peoples, that he was essentially encouraging group consciousness among them, which would ultimately result in attempts, in political movements attempting to break away from the Russian Empire. The Russian nationalists saw separatist movements as the fruit of the Ilminsky system. And as such, several of the Ilminsky's institutions in the Volga region and elsewhere were closed. It did seem for a time that the Ilminsky system was really on the verge of collapse. However, following the Russian Revolution of 1904-1905, it saw revival, particularly in the Volga region, where, led by this man, Bishop Andrei Utomsky, it revived. Again, gaining ever more institutions under Andrei, becoming a truly institutionalized mission in the region, becoming a truly institutionalized approach to missionary matters. Now let's go away from this kind of case study approach and go back towards a sort of general level examination of how the mission is now developing in the second half of the 19th century. So we commented before that really in the 18th and from much until the sort of 1830s, Russian Orthodoxy had lacked a really institutionalized mission. Now this has been changing, but it was still a rather ad hoc affair. Missionaries still tended to be priests who had a particular interest or were temporarily commanded to undertake missionary work. They often didn't possess particular training. There weren't really many institutions around offering a specialist missionary education. There wasn't any specialist missionary infrastructure beyond the normal infrastructure of a church and state supporting the missions. Now this has been, as we saw, this has already been changing in the 1830s, 1840s, and in the 1860s, a great period of change for all of Russian society. We really start to see the first true thorough institutionalization of the church, especially in terms of teaching and training. Now we saw that it had been established in Kazan in 1845, the notion of the anti-Islamic studies, a way of training missionaries to act against Islam. And by the 1860s, most of the ecclesiastical academies had chairs in teaching specific anti-missionary studies against different faiths. So, for instance, by the 1860s, all four of the ecclesiastical academies have a chair of anti-schismatic studies. That is to say, they have a chair dedicated to teaching people how to combat old belief. They would teach them about old believer social structures, old believer history, old believer theology. Of course, what they're showing is the old believer theology. They're showing it just in order to demonstrate how it's false and wrong, but nonetheless they do teach it. In Kazan, in particular, we find things like anti-Islamic studies, anti-Buddhist studies, where part of the training program is learning the languages involved in combating these faiths. In St. Petersburg, we see anti-Lutheranism, anti-Protestantism chair, for instance, which of course teaches things like principally German. So essentially the ecclesiastical academies have founded, by the 1860s, a new high level of teaching for those interested in undertaking missionary studies, which provides the requisite amount of knowledge, an acquaintance with strategies and tactics, knowledge of the necessary languages, etc., etc. Now, who were the missionaries themselves? As I mentioned, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the missionaries weren't really specialists. For one thing, there was very little in the way of specialist training for them. What they tended to be was normal Orthodox priests or monks who had perhaps an interest in missionary activities, a personal interest in missionary activities, or were temporarily commanded by their local hierarchs of the synod to undertake a brief tour of duty trying to combat whatever missionary group. So, for instance, just to give you a very quick example, there was the St. Petersburg in the 1840s. Nicholas I himself recruited a St. Petersburg priest, Timofey Volhovsky, and he was sent for a period of 4 years to Chernigov, Chernihiv in Ukraine, to essentially spend 4 or 5 years conducting a special mission against the old believers. But Volhovsky remained a normal priest with a normal parish in St. Petersburg, and his missionary assignment was only ever regarded by both himself, the synod, and the state as a temporary assignment. Now this changes when you get the training, proper training established in the academies. The church can start to train individuals whose only purpose, whose missionary activities and whose only training is a missionary specialization. These individuals were given their salaries, and I have to say they were relatively substantial salaries compared to the salaries of the Orthodox priesthood. In about the early 20th century, a missionary could be having a salary of about 2,800, 3,200 rubles, compared to the salaries of priests, who certainly very rarely rose above 1,000 rubles. So it could be a potentially profitable profession to become a missionary, although it had its problems, as we're going to see. And eventually, a sort of three-tier system of three-tier missionary structure arises as a way of dividing the territories between different individuals. So on the very highest level, you have all Russian missionaries. These are people who travel across the empire and do not specialize in a particular region. They go where they're requested or required. These individuals are usually the very best missionaries, the most famous missionaries, the most well-publicized missionaries. And they're usually requested to go and do a sort of special missions in different regions by bishops who fear the problem of, say, old belief or sectarianism is becoming too difficult for them to handle locally. And indeed, some of them are almost quasi-celebrities in their own right. Then there were the diocesan missionaries who basically lived in and specialized in a particular diocese. Touring around that diocese, conducting besieda, gathering funds, translating texts, establishing church libraries, etc., etc. Finally, there was the latter one, which is introduced last at the beginning of the 20th century, the district missionary, who is someone who is specialized on a single district of a diocese. And often these district missionaries could often be priests based in the local area, who had undertaken some missionary training, either in a seminary or in an extracurricular missionary course held somewhere in the diocese. And the fact that they were trying to create a special missionary class with a considerable salary, dedicated purely and wholly to the affairs of the mission, meant that the Orthodox Church could actually attract people from outside of the normal clerical estate. In other words, it could attract people beyond the normal beyond the normal priests and monks, who had, for most of the 19th century, been the major missionaries of the Orthodox Church. We noted, Macaulay Gulharev was a monk. Veniaminov was initially a priest, but he became a monk later. Indeed, he became a bishop later. That's a different story for another time. Now, from the 1860s onwards, the church is beginning to hire educated, religious laymen, parishioners, to become missionaries. Of course, they had to possess a high degree of education. Of course, they had to possess the necessary religious values, be pious people, be devoted churchmen. But certainly the church is beginning to employ lay people in its mission, beyond the normal priests and monks. Now, another increasing feature of the Russian Orthodox mission from the 1860s onwards is the appearance of missionary brotherhoods. And here we see basically in the Missionary Brotherhood is the church trying to source finances and other resources from among local society, trying to engage with society, with secular society, and bring them, mobilize them into its missionary activities. And equally, this is a way for secular society to show its care and concern for the status of orthodoxy among non-Orthodox peoples and in the non-Russian borderlands of the empire. So the first such society was created in 1860 for the Caucasus. And what they were was basically their groups of lay people and church people coming together to basically organize, to finance, to produce materials for and in support of the various Orthodox missionary campaigns going on across the empire. Some of these brotherhoods could be all empire. Their efforts could focus on anywhere across the empire. Others might have a diocesan basis. Others might be targeted against particular religions or at a particular cause. Yes, so I'll just give you a couple of examples of two missionary brotherhoods. So here we have an all-empire brotherhood, the Brotherhood of St. Pyotr the Metropolitan, based in Moscow. And the purpose of the Brotherhood of St. Pyotr the Metropolitan was the mission against the old believers. It was founded in 1872 by the professor of anti-old believer studies at the Moscow Ecclesiastical Academy, Nikolai Subbotin. He was also probably the most prolific scholar on old belief in this period, though of course it's difficult to use his works today because he was profoundly anti-old believer and profoundly opposed to them. And the the Brotherhood of St. Pyotr was indeed quite successful at raising funds, producing materials, holding speeches and events in the cause of the anti-old believer mission. By the beginning of the 20th century, it had published 500,000 copies of 125 books and pamphlets written against the old believers. Drawing in donations and funds, drawing in donations from its members, who so it's a big one, I'll just start that again. Charging its members an annual membership fee, and gaining donations from various secular figures and organizations. The Brotherhood of St. Pyotr was able to sponsor a large array of various missionary campaigns across the empire targeted at the old believers. For instance, we can talk about sponsoring the missionary campaigns of the former old believer monk Pavel Prusky, a semi-celebrity figure who lived in Moscow, who preached very strongly against the old believers, was frequently dispatched on the funds of the Brotherhood, Brotherhood of St. Pyotr, to go to various different dioceses to preach among the old believers, to conduct the Sieda among them, and to attempt to convert them. And indeed, the works of Pavel Prusky are printed in huge numbers, precisely through the printing press, or the independent printing press of the Brotherhood of St. Pyotr. Now, a local example, on which we'll probably talk a little bit more about tomorrow in terms of what it does, but this is, and of course it has an extremely long name, the Baltic Orthodox Brotherhood of Christ the Saviour and the Veil of the Mother of God. For the purposes of this lecture and the lecture tomorrow, we'll simply refer to it as the Baltic Orthodox Brotherhood, or the BOB. The BOB, founded in 1881, 1882, was an all Baltic provinces institution, so it covered both Kurland, Estland and Livland, the three Baltic provinces, and its aim was to support the spread of orthodoxy among Latvian and Estonian-speaking peasantries. Its leadership body was in St. Petersburg, where it was headed by an outstanding member of the imperial elite, Galkin Vlaskoy, Mikhail Galkin Vlaskoy, who had actually himself been a former governor of Estland province. And its position in St. Petersburg was precisely, and his role as the head was precisely in order to draw funds from the very highest echelons, the very highest strata of Imperial Russian society, which could be directed into the Baltic Orthodox churches to build churches, to translate materials into Estonian and Latvian, to sponsor, to help poor converts to Orthodoxy, to help the poorest clergy in the region, to provide icons, and other liturgical equipment to churches, basically to try and, as much as possible, support the cause of Orthodoxy in the Baltic provinces. By the 1914, it had established considerable success. A large number of local branches of this brotherhood had been founded throughout the Baltic provinces, and it had also played a major role in some of the most public manifestations of Orthodoxy in the Baltic presence. It had put a lot of money into the Putitsa convent, for instance. You see the picture here. Putitsa convent in what is today Eastern Estonia. And it had put a lot of money into the construction of the St. Alexander Nevsky Orthodox Cathedral in Tallinn. The missionary movements also showed signs of increasing organization at the end of the 19th century, increasing attempts to meet together and engage in discussion about the problems of the mission and what should be done about those problems. There are 5 all-Russian missionary congresses held between the 1880s and the First World War, where missionaries from across the Russian Empire, I beg your pardon, the 5th Missionary Congress was held in 1917, so between the 1880s and 1917. And these all Russian missionary congresses drew missionaries, individuals interested in the mission from across the empire, where they convened together to discuss how the mission was going, how various different missionary outreach approaches or campaigns were going, what their problems were, and what should be the solution. And these were becoming increasingly popularized, increasingly public events, where leading churchmen, not just missionaries, but leading bishops, were given a forum in which to discuss not just the problems of the mission, but also the problems of the Russian church and the problems of Russian society in the period. These new missionary congresses, in other words, are being used as public forums where the church can address and engage a much larger public than simply missionary specialists. Now, there were more specialized sort of missionary congresses as well, those being held in the dioceses or in various regions to discuss the special problems being generated by in those particular areas. So, for instance, I gave you here the example of the 1887 Irkutsk Diocese Missionary Congress, which, of course, explicitly met to discuss its 2 major problems. Firstly, the Buddhism among the bureaucrats, so in other words, discuss the anti-Buddhist mission, and secondly, to discuss the anti-shaman mission, in other words, the anti-polytheist mission. Similarly, similar congresses, for instance, that we'd held perhaps in the Volga region, for instance, would discuss anti-Muslim, anti-shaman strategies, etc., etc. However, the synod remains slow in finally giving the Russian Orthodox mission the last accoutrements of institutionalization. In other words, bringing the missionary movement inside the synod itself and bringing it firmly, more directly under centralized synodal control. It is only in 1913, in other words, a year before the outbreak of the First World War, that the synod essentially creates, within its bureaucracy, a central missionary council which bears responsibility for all of the missionary affairs going on in the Russian Empire and unites all of the missionary affairs under a single body. However, the fact of the matter is it was established very late, 1913. A year later, the war began, basically drawing all finances away from efforts like missionary activities and into charity and into supporting the Russian army. And then, of course, in 1917, the Romanov state collapsed into revolution and civil war. Basically, so this new centralized missionary authority under the synod had very little opportunity to use to do anything during this brief period of existence. I think we'll skip that as we're going on for a while. What was it like then? Just a few last words on this subject. What was it like being a missionary? Well, I've given you here an example of one individual, Dmitry Bogolubov. Bogolubov we know a lot about because he published his diary from when he was a young missionary. He published it in sort of the 1910s, I believe, therefore giving us a very sort of deep and personal insight into what it was like to be a missionary in Russia at the time. So he was an anti-sectarian missionary. So in other words, his major focus was combating things like baptism, like the Dukhoborya, the Molokanya, various other groups we discussed in the last lecture. And he was a missionary between 1894 and 1913, coming from the Moscow Ecclesiastical Academy. Now, he was a priest, so he wasn't a layman, he was a priest. And he basically focused on, I believe it was sort of the central Russia region. And he tells a story of sort of constant discomforts, mostly located sort of everyday discomforts of traveling around the central Russian countryside. The muddy, bumpy roads which he had to travel over on horse or by carriage, sometimes impassable depending on the weather. He tells stories of, sleeping in dark, smoky, dingy peasant huts, often on the floor or on a very makeshift bed, being attacked by insects during the night, barely ever getting a night's sleep. One of the major sort of takeaways we get from this is, of course, when Bogolubov was in the Ecclesiastical Academy training to be a missionary, he gained a very theoretical, highly abstract knowledge about religion and about orthodoxy for the first thing, and about the sectarian beliefs and practices the second thing. And he found that there wasn't really that this kind of knowledge, this kind of in-depth theoretical, theological knowledge, wasn't really of any use to him when he was in the village. Peasant sectarians and their audiences were much more interested in practical aspects of religion than having an abstract theological debate. In other words, Bogolubov found that his education has certainly not primed him to be the best missionary among the peasants. His concerns were very far removed from this very theoretical conceptualization of religion. And he found that he could not simply, enter these communities and be immediately respected, but he had to build a network of connections, of links with other respected individuals in the community, in these communities who had a degree of social respect and prestige. Namely, he had to cooperate strongly with firstly the local Orthodox priests themselves operating in the region, but also individuals like school teachers, police officers, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to give you there a sort of from the ground view, as much as possible, of how a missionary operated in this, how missionaries operated at this time. So then, just to give you a summary then of what we've talked about today. So the Russian Orthodox Church's mission truly becomes widespread really only in the 19th century. As we saw, efforts in the 18th century were very sporadic, and they can't really be called missions as such. I mean, the forcible conversion of the Volga polytheist peoples was not really a mission. It was, as I said, just a forcible mass baptism. Nor can we really describe sort of the efforts to tempt Muslim elites after the conquest of Kazan into Orthodoxy by offering them a privileged position in the elite, the Russian Orthodox elite, Russian state elite. We can't really call this a sort of missionary approach either. The mission as a special institution only really flowers in Russia in the 19th century. And even then, it takes until the 1860s for specialist missionary training, for specialist missionary positions, for a missionary infrastructure made up of brotherhoods, sourcing funds and materials from local society to come into existence. And finally, all of this is only really centralized in 1913 with the creation of the Missionary Council under the Synod. So in other words, the Russian Orthodox missionary program truly comes into its own in the 19th century. But it does so slowly, in an ad hoc way, gradually piece by piece, falling into place. There is never a sort of moment of where a single moment where a fully fledged Orthodox mission is created. It grows, evolves gradually over the course of the 19th century, with a result that it lacks some fundamental strengths. Like, for instance, it lacks a fully centralized body which can oversee it and indeed finance it until essentially it was too late in 1913. Before then, the mission had largely been down to the initiatives of various localities, individuals, and different groups, brotherhoods, bishops, congresses, etc., etc. Now, the Russian Orthodox mission did have some real successes in the 19th century. We discussed two of them. In the Altai and Alaska, it has managed to establish an enduring Orthodox tradition in these regions, converting, by the beginning of the 20th century, most of the people of these regions to Orthodoxy, and therefore establishing the framework for, in the 20th century, the emergence of sort of new indigenous Orthodox traditions. Others, however, are far, far less successful. The old mission against the old believers never really goes well. The only period in the 20th century when it goes well, really, is under Nicholas I, and that's because Nicholas I, as I mentioned, is basically persecuting the old believers until they join the Orthodox Church. And after he dies, that gradually stops, and again, old belief reasserts its popularity. The same can be said for the new sectarian faiths emerging at the end of the 19th century, especially for baptism, whose success is never really truly dented by its opponents, the Russian Orthodox missionaries. The reality was that the Russian Orthodox mission was always reliant on the infrastructure provided to it by the state. It was reliant on that framework. It was often reliant directly on police measures to push, or somehow police and legal measures that pushed people into orthodoxy or kept them in orthodoxy. Remember the law forbidding apostasy, forbidding people from converting away from orthodoxy, and imposing punishments on them for doing so. The Russian state had its law forbidding other religions from preaching, from conducting missionary methods of their own. In other words, the Russian Orthodox mission was reliant on the privileged position that the state created for it, and the lack of competition that the state created for it. Now, in 1905, after the Edict of Toleration, the situation fundamentally changes. The law against apostasy is abolished. The law against other faiths operating missions is abolished, following the Edict of Toleration. In other words, this is a call for the Russian Orthodox missionary to adapt, to find new ways to move on from its reliance on police measures, on legal support, and develop new approaches to the mission. But as the Fourth Missionary Congress in Kiev in 1910 demonstrates, they're never really able to do this. In the Kiev Missionary Congress in 1910, the resolutions basically asked the state to re-establish police measures in support of Russian Orthodoxy. The Church and its mission do not successfully adapt to the new conditions of religious pluralism created by the Edict of Toleration. Now that concludes the main lecture. I just want to give you a very, very quick, I think I've already gone on for long enough, but I just want to give you a very quick sort of addendum to the lecture, looking at Russian Orthodoxy's spread beyond the Russian Empire between 1700 and 1918. I'm just going to do so quickly with two examples. By the way, this is a very beautiful picture. This is a Japanese icon of Mary and the Christ child, the baby Jesus. As we're going to see, Orthodoxy is spread into Japan in the 19th century. Now, firstly, there was China. Of course, the Catholic Church had attempted to spread Catholicism in China in the 17th century through the Jesuits, ultimately not having much success and indeed essentially being driven out. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church had a somewhat different experience in the 18th century. It was allowed, with the creation of a Russian embassy in Beijing, it was basically allowed, with the creation of a Russian embassy in Beijing in 1712, the embassy was allowed to have a church. And that church was allowed to operate a small mission strictly within the city limits of Beijing. However, various treaties ensured that this activity of this mission would always be highly limited. Not only could it not move out from beyond Beijing, but it also had to respect the Chinese demand that the Russian missionaries do not interfere in Chinese political life. And Chinese political life could be defined very, very widely. Sometimes in the missionary compound, in the diplomatic compound around the Russian embassy, there was a school which had a number of Chinese pupils. However, the largest sort of Orthodox group in China was basically these Cossacks who had emigrated to China during the expansion of the Russian Empire into Siberia. So in other words, they'd crossed the Chinese border and settled in China. And these individuals still maintained a degree of orthodoxy. Basically, orthodoxy in China never really moves beyond this. There is, as I mentioned, the school operates periodically in Beijing within the embassy compound. We think that by the beginning of the 20th century, there was about 500 Chinese Orthodox. And as I mentioned, most of these was kind of these descendants of Russian Cossacks who had settled in China in the course of the 17th century. There were efforts to translate Orthodox texts into Chinese. But unsurprisingly, really the largest Orthodox presence in China was in Harbin, where there were near the Russian border. Today there are about 15,000 Chinese Orthodox. And because China is still an officially communist state, which still officially leads a large degree of prohibition against religious institutions, the Orthodox Church, the Chinese have no real independent Orthodox Church of their own. They're basically dependent on the Moscow Patriarchate for their priests. It has some degree of administrative independence, but beyond that, not very much. Now, actually, the Japanese story contrasts quite significantly with the Chinese case. As I'm sure some of you are aware, Japan, following its encounters with the European world, had isolated itself for centuries, deep into the 19th century. Finally, in 1854, the American Commodore John Parry, quote-unquote, opened Japan to the West. In other words, went there and threatened that if Japan started opening its ports, then essentially Western fleets would start to bomb them. And this began a period of sort of Japanese history of opening up to especially to European influence, and also of rapid-fire modernization. And very shortly after the Americans had opened up Japan for Western trade, Russia established an embassy in Japan, an embassy in this country. And one of the members of this embassy was a monk. He went to run the embassy's Orthodox Church. In other words, to give the sacraments to the members of staff of the embassy. He opened this church in 1861, and during his stay, he's working in the embassy, he began to learn Japanese, and indeed attained fluency in that language. In 1870, Alexander II officially opened a Japanese Orthodox mission to be headed by the monk Nikolai Kasatkin. And Nikolai, through the money coming in from this new mission, begins to translate a large number of books and religious texts into Japanese, and increasingly receive an ever-increasing flock. I'll give you the figures here. By 1878, in other words, 8 years after the establishment of this Japanese mission, there are about 6,000 Japanese Orthodox. Nikolai was both a charismatic, energetic, and pragmatic individual. He understood when to make compromises, but also how to engage his audiences, make orthodoxy a sort of applicable to Japanese lives and experiences. And as a result of Nikolai's charisma and energy, the Japanese Orthodox Church rapidly developed from 6,000 in 1878 to an estimated 33,000 in 1912. Orthodoxy even made an imprint on the local urban landscape of Japan with the opening of a large Orthodox cathedral in 1891. Now, Japanese Orthodoxy basically suffered horrendously in the interwar period, when Japanese imperialists, nationalists, quasi-fascists took over the country and began to sort of attack anything that wasn't regarded as being traditional Japanese culture. As a result, today, there still is a Japanese Orthodox Church. It still has a flock of about 9,700 people. It has its own metropolitan, but again, it is under the aegis of the Moscow Patriarchate, although in its administration it is an autonomous church. These are the two major examples that I can think of. I mean, there are a few isolated instances of it spreading in Africa, of Russian Orthodoxy spreading in Africa. But these are the two major examples of Russian Orthodoxy moving beyond the borders of the empire. For the most part, the presence of Russian Orthodoxy abroad, let's say in Europe and in Americas, has been serving Orthodox emigre communities in those various countries. In this sense, it reflects very strongly this kind of tradition among Orthodox churches of not conducting a mission outside its own communities or its own national groups. That kind of ends my sort of addendum. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time when we discuss Orthodoxy in the Baltic provinces. Thank you very much.